why don't we go ahead and move forward here to something that some of you may be somewhat aware of, because in the United States, we had a federal holiday yesterday. I'm sure some people had the day off. It was the federal holiday for Juneteenth, which is a very new federal holiday, although it's been celebrated for many, many years. A lot to it, a lot of very relevant history, and a lot of different pieces branching off from that history. And we are very, very honored to be joined here as we continue the show by Dr. Gerald Horne, who's a professor of history and African American studies at the University of Houston. Dr. Horne, as always, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, thanks so much for being here as always. And, in a way I wish everyone did know, but I assume a lot of people don't know. So when we talk about Juneteenth, I mean, what is really being celebrated here? How did Juneteenth become a holiday such as it is now that has been celebrated for so many years by African Americans and now at least ostensibly by the whole country?
Well, first of all, let me say that like most sane people, I support the concept of Juneteenth, despite the fact that the official narrative around Juneteenth is misleading at best. The official narrative is that on June 19th, 1865, General Gordon Granger showed up in order to apprise the Black folk in Galveston who had been enslaved that, don't you folks know you were free? That is to say, pursuant to Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863. But that's misleading, because, as I'm sure you and your audience know, the Emancipation Proclamation applied precisely to those states where the Lincoln administration had no jurisdiction. It certainly had no jurisdiction in Texas. Texas was in rebellion against the United States of America, and that is the actual reality. So what happened, in fact, was that General Granger showed up in order to enforce the end of the U.S. Civil War from the barrel of a gun, because the enslaving class had this diabolical scheme to continue slavery. How so, you ask? Well, recall that during the midst of the U.S. Civil War, the French, under the leadership of their puppet, Maximilian, had taken over Mexico. That is the root of the holiday we mark Cinco de Mayo, May 5th, which marks a victory of progressive Mexicans over French occupation forces. And so the idea of the enslaving class in Texas was to move en masse to Mexico and or collaborate with the puppet regime in Mexico to ensure enslavement of Africans on this side of the border. What happens, of course, is that that plan does not succeed, not least because there was an uprising in Mexico against the French puppet leader, Maximilian, assisted, I'm happy to say, by Black men in blue, that is to say, Black members of the U.S. forces, who execute a kind of pincers movement against the occupation forces, which leads to June 19th, 1867, when the French leader Maximilian is captured and executed. And I dare say that that second Juneteenth, June 19th, 1867, brought the United States and brought Texas in particular closer to abolition of enslavement than the original Juneteenth, 1865, which we marked and celebrated yesterday.
Wow. And I mean, it's not exactly talked about like that when we talk about Juneteenth today, obviously. But, there is this, I guess we could call it like right-wing backlash to having this holiday, which turns into this partisan issue of Republican versus Democrat. I'm curious when we talk about the backlash to having a holiday like Juneteenth. I want to take it outside of the partisan issue and ask you to maybe put it in the context of the constant reaction or reactionary view to the idea of even recognizing the immense crime of slavery, and the fact that after slavery was abolished, which is what you're an expert on, there was a counter-revolution, if you will, to try to prevent emancipation, like a real kind of emancipation, from taking place. I guess I'm asking if you could kind of thread that behavior, that sort of counter-revolution, to the attitude we see today towards, people antagonizing the idea of Juneteenth.
Well, I think we're in the midst, sad to say, of another counter-revolutionary moment. That's the import of book bannings in high school libraries. That's the import of school principals in a state like Texas being driven out of office. That's the import of the fact that in Texas and Florida, there has been an attempt to deem illegitimate the 1619 Project of Howard University professor Nicole Hannah-Jones, not least because it put forward the apparent seditious notion that when the settlers in 1776 revolted against British rule, that had something to do with enslavement of Africans. I think part of the contradiction is that on the one hand, as we will ascertain on July 4th, there is a celebration across class and ideological lines in the United States of 1776, of the founding of the United States, despite the fact that the state was founded and was led for decades by enslavers. And then, of course, we're trying to carry in our minds the companion notion that slavery was a crime against humanity, slavery was somehow illegitimate. But that's a difficult circle to square. On the one hand, celebrating the handiwork of enslavers in 1776, and on the other hand, saying that enslavement itself was a crime against humanity. And so as a result of that contradiction, you see the ground prepared for this backlash against telling the true story of slavery. You see what's happening in Florida, where there have been attempts to teach in high school the idea that there are positive aspects to slavery. Supposedly, people learned skills, believe it or not. But once again, this stems from this fundamental contradiction about the origins and founding of the past slaveholders' republic.
Well, and to extend that point a little bit further, and just in sort of thinking about Texas in the center of this, when we talk about the current sort of right-wing backlash, and we also, think about the history of the Confederacy, even the foundation of Texas, it's interesting when we look at, and I'm curious your thoughts about this in the broader sort of American body politic, if you will. It does seem like Texas, not to slight anyone from Texas, but that it does seem to play something of an outsized role in both the formation and the continuity around the far-right trend in American society.
Oh, absolutely. And feel free, from my point of view, to slight the Lone Star State because it deserves it. I've oftentimes argued, in fact, I did argue in my book, The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and the Roots of U.S. Fascism, that Texas is to the United States as the United States is to the world. That is to say, just as the United States drags the international community to the right, Texas drives the United States to the right. And we also know that when Texas seceded from Mexico in 1836 and set up an independent republic, that a motive force for this was precisely the fact that Mexico, under a leader of African descent, centuries before Barack Obama, had executed the abolition of enslavement. And those like Sam Houston and Stephen F. Austin, who were enslavers and then named ostentatiously leading Texas cities after themselves, were not having it. They rebelled, set up an independent republic, which became a competitor to a certain degree of the United States of America in terms of enslaving Africans. The Lone Star flag could be found off the coast of Angola, off the coast of Brazil, off the coast of Cuba. And then during the U.S. Civil War, Texas was the state least damaged by the incursions of the Lincoln Army, not least because it bordered an independent state, speaking of Mexico, under French occupation, and therefore was supplied amply with many of those supplies then transshipped to neighboring states like Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia to keep them afloat. So in some ways, Texas is continuing that inglorious legacy of being a major anchor of reactionary politics, both domestically and globally.
Gerald, as we approach July 4th, which you brought up a bit earlier, and you talked about the contradiction, across the ideological spectrum, like you said, you have the celebration of July 4th and this genuine belief, because that's what we're taught in the U.S., that America is like this amazing democracy. You know, it's like sort of the leader of the democratic world. It's the first democracy in the world. But when you look at the founding of the US, not even to mention, you know, the genocide of the native people in North America, but you add to it the enslavement, the literal kidnapping of people from a continent of Africa brought to the US, forced to labor, forced to basically like give up their children to become slaves to other people, hunted down if they escaped. That doesn't sound very democratic to me. It actually sounds very fascist to me. I'm just curious, would you qualify the U.S. as a fascist state in its founding? I just don't see how it can really be seen as anything else if there's people who are literally in bondage.
Well, that's the import of my aforementioned book, which carries the subtitle Texas Slavery and Jim Crow and the Roots of U.S. Fascism. But I'm happy to report, to lift the gloom and doom, that there is an increasing split and schism in the historical guild. You have a number of historians who are revisiting the origin of the United States of America. I'm thinking of the late Tyler Stovall of UC Berkeley. I'm thinking of the late philosopher Charles Mills and his book, Racial Contract. I'm thinking of the Haitian-born filmmaker Raoul Peck and his stirring documentary, Exterminate All the Brutes. Even Pulitzer Prize winners like Alan Taylor of the University of Virginia are moving slowly but surely in that direction. Part of the problem is that some of this historiography has escaped the attention of our friends on the left, who tend to latch on to the old-time religion of Thomas Jefferson being the epitome of democracy, despite the fact that he was an enslaver, despite the fact that he wanted to rid North America of all free Negroes. And that leads to what I consider to be these kinds of contradictions, where there's not sufficiently aggressive pushback against, for example, these measures coming out of states like Texas and Florida to circumscribe the teaching of Black history, because at root, I'm afraid to say that some of our friends on the left actually agree with the right. And as long as that is the case, we'll certainly be in trouble.
No, I think it's a well-taken point. I remember Cornel West's response to the DeSantis situation was that he also loves the classics. So, yeah, confusion abounding all around on that front. And you know, I think this is an interesting issue that I also want your thoughts on in this sense of, you know, the role of commemorations like Juneteenth in historical memory. Because I think some people see, okay, well, you know, all these holidays become so corporate. They become, you know, the Pentagon is celebrating them. I think some people often ask, do we lose as much as we gain when these holidays, Martin Luther King Day, Juneteenth, are institutionalized?
Well, I understand the sentiment, and I'm sympathetic to the sentiment. But my overriding issue is that when you have a paid holiday for the working class, this is a step towards redistribution of the wealth. This is a blow against the employer class. It is a gift from the descendants of the unpaid sector of the working class, speaking of those we refer to as the enslaved, to the working class as a whole. And that is the context in which we should mark Juneteenth, which we should celebrate Juneteenth. And that's why I think Juneteenth and the establishment of it as a federal holiday has been a step forward for the entire working class.
No. Well, well, if I can get myself together here, I certainly agree. I was happy to have the day off, as it were. But as always, Dr. Horne, we really appreciate you coming on and helping us sort through all of this. And I couldn't recommend more highly The Counter-Revolution of 1836. All of your books I can recommend highly, but I really, really enjoyed that text. But thank you so much for giving us some of your time here in the Freedom Side.
Thank you for inviting me.